Hi, friends. Welcome back to the Hill of Roses, where we come once again to celebrate the best works of the social left and debate the policy positions of the movement we create together. Thanks for tuning in last week, where we gave our thoughts on the most effective path to a social democracy, and we celebrated the work Represent Us was doing in bringing about electoral reform so that we can sooner reach that goal. So for this week's episode, we did a poll where we got a lot more participation than last week, as we had nearly 2,100 of you vote compared to only 40 last time. So clearly, there's a lot of demand to know, outside of Bernie Sanders, who we've celebrated in the past, who is our best candidate to take the Democratic mantle and lead us against Donald Trump in 2020. The choices you all had to decide between were Andrew Yang and his Yang Gang, Tulsi Gabbard and Team Tulsi, Elizabeth Warren and her Warren Wonks, and finally, Peter Buttigieg and the Buttigieg Buddies. So, you the fans decided that Andrew Yang is our next best option, as 38% of you selected him, and he beat the runner-up Tulsi Gabbard by 9%. Furthermore, Elizabeth Warren and Peter Buttigieg were not far off either, as they both hovered around 17% consistently throughout. After conducting the initial poll, I followed up with 4 further rounds of polling to better establish the Hill of Roses candidate tier levels that I'm pleased to share with you all now. So, in our first tier, the S tier, or, the supreme tier, we have quite the shocker, as most fans would presume I may have only one candidate in Bernie Sanders, when in fact, I have 3. Bernie Sanders, Tulsi Gabbard, and Andrew Yang have all made it into the S tier, with Bernie still comfortably in the 1 spot, and Tulsi and Andrew neck and neck, with one slightly ahead of the other, as I will elaborate upon more in depth later in the video. Next, we have the A tier, where we have a singular candidate in Elizabeth Warren, as she has angered the left base by playing politics too often and making unforced gaffes that seem at the behest of consultants rather than trusting her populist lefty wonk instincts. Elizabeth Warren is an innovator when it comes to creating solutions to existing issues, with issues like the CFPB put forth, a wealth tax, the Anti-Corruption and Public Integrity Act, refinancing student loans, strengthening Social Security, giving more work scheduling flexibility, addressing conflicts of interest in the executive branch, and investing in biomedical research. This innovative perspective on existing present issues extends also into her platform by extending worker control of corporations to 40%, manufacturing generic drugs to create a public option, increasing affordable housing, investing $100 billion in public health initiatives to address the opioid crisis, bailing out Puerto Rico's debt, banning lobbyists, and instituting a U.S. Office of Public Integrity, putting in place a federal office to prosecute financial crimes on Wall Street, forcing disclosure on carbon emissions, and a Glass-Steagall 2.0. In many ways, comparisons of her being a female Bernie Sanders are understandable, but unfortunately, there are key differences between the two that leaves Warren in the A tier rather than the S tier. These reasons can be best highlighted through the issue of Medicare for All, a policy Elizabeth Warren has on her platform, but when pressed on the issue, her true colors appear. Elizabeth Warren co-sponsors Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All policy, but whenever asked on the issue of eliminating private health insurance, she frequently dodges the question, claiming the real goal is to make sure everyone is covered in an affordable way. From these responses, we can interpret that she's trying to walk a fine line of supporting the progressive branding of Medicare for All by co-sponsoring the bill, while not trying to ruffle many moderate feathers by outright calling for an end to private health insurance, which leaves her advocating for a Medicare public option. This shows who Elizabeth Warren is as an individual, a person who believes we need to corral and regulate the downsides of capitalism rather than admit that capitalism is working as designed and instead fully replacing it in industries where the profit motive doesn't make sense to be applied, and embracing large social programs to replace them like Bernie Sanders does. I at one point was considering moving Elizabeth Warren to the B tier due to her admission that she would take corporate PAC money in the general election. But upon reflection, I understand her position now. We have an opponent in Republicans who have no issues in using big money and distorting our political system to their favor with the power they've earned in office through purging voters off the ballot, as we saw in races like Georgia, or gerrymandering, as we've seen all over the country. Currently, Democrats are fighting for campaign finance / electoral reform in the Senate with the For the People Act, as we mentioned last week. And Democrats like Elizabeth Warren have co-sponsored it. So I understand not prematurely, unilaterally disarming when it may help us win an election that can allow us to sign these types of laws into effect. So all parties must compete fairly. Furthermore, she has at least promised to campaign fairly and representatively of the people in the primary so that we can hear her true thoughts and she doesn't get an unfair advantage over a clean candidate who hasn't taken any corporate PAC money or large dollar bundling fundraising. I understand and respect her decision, even though it wouldn't be the same one that I probably would make. And that is why I've decided to not knock her and instead keep her as the sole member of the A tier. So next, we have the B tier. In the B tier, we have all the candidates we would definitely show up to vote for, but that we wouldn't be so enthusiastic for that we would go out and campaign for. In this tier, we have Peter Buttigieg, Marianne Williamson, Jay Inslee, Dario Hunter, Ian Schlakman, and finally Wayne Messam, who announced an exploratory committee 2 days ago. This is in the first tier in which we find ourselves seeing candidates from other parties, as Ian Schlakman and Dario Hunter both compete for the Green Party nomination. I think given the election cycle, it's very, very unlikely that a third-party nominee will win. And that's why, despite solid platforms for both Schlakman and Hunter, they're going to get knocked because they lack as much political experience as some of these other candidates. And the prospect of a third-party candidate in this election, when we have more options than 2016, can end up having unintended consequences of doing more harm than good. From this tier, it's, in my opinion, that the candidate most capable of escaping this tier and jumping into the A tier or above is Jay Inslee. He has his issues, like most Democrats do in areas like, Homeland Security. And I'm highly skeptical of him for being in the new Democrat caucus, which is a corporate caucus of the Democratic Party. But he has a stellar voting record overall. He served in both state and federal office, and he's put forth bold policy priorities in first and foremost focusing on climate change, including the implementation of a Green New Deal, having believable dovish foreign policy as he voted against the Iraq War, as well as government reforms such as abolishing the Electoral College and the current filibuster rules, And finally, he's advocating for solutions like providing statehood to Puerto Rico and D.C. However, I think the reason Inslee will never reach that tier is healthcare. Because he, like many of the other candidates, believes a public option is superior to a full Medicare for all implementation. And his own implementation in his state of Washington wasn't even a public option, but the government provisioning insurance coverage from a rotation of private providers. This in turn led Inslee to have historically low favorability ratings in his home state as governor. Couple him failing this litmus test with his desire to make the minimum wage $12 instead of $15, and we have a recipe for mediocrity I could still confidently vote for, as I think he wouldn't make things worse in any area necessarily too much, but he wouldn't necessarily improve all the critical areas as much as we desire. In addition to Inslee, a side note should be given to Peter Buttigieg, who has shown himself to be a composed and logical orator, in addition to being an overall successful mayor, even if he has some contractors on how he addressed the homeless populations. Peter shows glimmers of potential to rise if he can pave himself a niche into electoral/political reform with his ideas of abolishing the Electoral College and reforming our Supreme Court. But currently, he hasn't shown that foresight to try and carve that niche out, and instead has hurt his candidacy, like many candidates, by settling into a public option rather than Medicare for all during town hall performances. I doubt Pete will turn things around and embrace the lefty inspirations of Bernie Sanders that originally led him into wanting to get into politics, as after his elevation into the national spotlight from his run in the 2017 DNC chair race, he used the remaining funds he had in his leadership PAC, the Hitting Home PAC, to fund centrists like Joe Donnelly and 22 other candidates for the House, with Andy Kim being the lone exception of a progressive contribution. It's clear where Pete's ideology loyalties lie, and I'm afraid it's unlikely to lead to any particularly bold proposals. So next, we have the C tier. These are candidates that have shown a recency to embrace progressive rhetoric and some progressive policies, but their overall records show a very inconsistent history at embracing the left and have supported policies opposing our beliefs on major issues. Because of this, I recognize these as candidates I would consider at looking at a third party if my state was safely blue, but that I would definitely vote for if my state was purple or red. I, luckily living in New Jersey, am in safe blue territory. The candidates currently occupying this C tier are the following: Kamala Harris, Julian Castro, Cory Booker, Kirsten Gillibrand, and Beto O'Rourke, who announced his 2020 run this week. I would go into why they deserve to be in this tier, but in the effort to save some time and to stay mostly positive, as we're the Hill of Roses, we'll likely cover that in future episodes celebrating other people's doing the work to investigate their records. One note before moving to the D tier: You the Fans, by wide margins, stated that of all the individuals in the C tier, the one you would want to vote for the least is Kamala Harris. I find this interesting despite knowing her heavy baggage as AG and support from the establishment, and her unwillingness not to take big dollar money in primaries, when her voting record was essentially the same as Bernie Sanders in her one term in the Senate, except for 2 votes. One in which I think she got it right on immigration, and another where she gets it wrong on sanctioning Iran while we were in the Iran deal. So now, after that, we have our D tier. These are Democratic candidates that are full-blown centrists and moderates who accept that label and roughly agree with Donald Trump at least 30% of the time, far above Democratic averages. These are candidates that would let me know that if they became the nominee, that the Democratic Party no longer represents me because they, on too many issues, would work against my priorities, and in turn, I would look to support a third-party candidate instead, and also spend future capital to support the formation of a new party, as we discussed on last week's episode. The candidates in the D tier are the following: Joe Biden, Amy Klobuchar, John Delaney, and John Hickenlooper. If you're a supporter of them and you made it this far, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I'm not saying you or those candidates are bad people. There are many good people who we simply disagree with. But your vision for the future directly contradicts mine, and a big tent party can only really go so far. If you truly are the center of the Democratic Party, well then that makes me a radical Democrat who needs a new party to call home. So then finally, we have the F tier. These are individuals that are actively the enemy on many topics, preventing a more just and prosperous economy. If you support these people, I'm definitely judging you a little bit negatively as a person unlike my D tier associates. To use an analogy from Barack Obama, Republicans are like driving in reverse, while Democrats are trying to drive forward. It just so happens that some of our D tier candidates just might be driving in the wrong direction. However, even driving without correct directions can sometimes have you stumble into correct parts of the path, while going in reverse does no one any good. Our country is divided, and it is our responsibility to hear the pain of people like ourselves that have been led astray. To inform them of solutions that will actually address those challenges that they face, and inform them of how the Republicans they currently are supporting are not doing what's right for them. The F tier, as you can clearly guess, is comprised of the following two members: Donald Trump and Bill Weld. If you're a Trump supporter still, ask yourself, what has he actually done to benefit you? If you can't answer that, then stop letting him bait you into voting against something, and instead find someone with solutions to vote for. So now, with our tier lists out of the way, it's time I answer the hardest and first question posed in our polling this week. Who is my best backup? Is it Andrew Yang or is it Tulsi Gabbard? After knowing Tulsi's record for many years, and Andrew being relatively new to the political scene, I wanted to do a deep dive on Andrew's policy platform to see what he was selling beyond the UBI plan that has brought him to the point of national attention to have already reached the unique donator quantity to qualify him for the debates. So, across Andrew's platform, which I've included in the description section below, include 76 categories and 256 policies which I've reviewed. Of those 256, I found that I only disagreed with Andrew 10 times. And of those 10, 4 I believe could be easily settled through getting more clarity or through some compromise. Andrew's platform was much more than just 96% agreeable. It was exciting and innovative, with solutions to not only the challenges of today, but the challenges we will be facing in the near future as well. I highly encourage you to read it, even if you feel confident you have a locked-in candidate like Bernie. One policy stood out to me in particular, and was the reason why I went from fairly impressed and putting him in the A tier to being an S tier candidate. And that was when I saw how he came up with a pretty unique solution to the cost of higher education that I too had come up with and shared with a few, telling me that they had told me that they hadn't heard of these ideas before. The idea is simple. Make a college degree cost the amount it benefits you. If you get a college degree and it only leaves you with job prospects of a minimum wage job, then you shouldn't be straddled with debt for the failure of a college that to prepare you for the workforce. The way you put this into practice is you give incoming students an opt-in program for free college tuition in exchange for a permanent small tax a little bit below 1%. That way, if you're incredibly successful, you'll end up paying more, but it won't impact you as much since you're already well off. While if you're not doing well, your degree ends up costing less than it normally would. Furthermore, this would also encourage universities to help their students become even more successful, as the university's revenue from the student is directly tied to their success. This mindset reminds me of my connection with Andrew Yang's entrepreneurial spirit, because a program like this is similar to a student receiving a seed investment from the government in exchange for a little bit less than 1% of the equity of their career. However, as I mentioned, there are 10 issues I still grapple with Andrew upon that keeps him from earning my top praise. So, first, the 4 policies I think could be resolved with, a little bit more clarity or compromise. And that's the following. So, we got the American Mall Act, local journalism grants, reducing the federal workforce, and increasing the president's salary to $4 million. I believe for the Mall Act and the journalism grants, I would need to see more clarity to assure we're not subsidizing multinational corporations or other big businesses to set them up in malls, as well as that journalism grants selection process has the needed transparency to assure that it is not only rewarding pro-government journalists. In regards to reducing the federal workforce, his overall point is that we need to address the inefficiencies in government, and that by modernizing the processes through some consulting analysis, we could probably find 15% of the workforce to cut. So I agree with his assessment that our current federal workforce isn't working as efficiently as it should, and that cuts in certain areas are tenable. However, I disagree with the overall notion of reducing the federal workforce and forcing nearly 300,000 individuals to go unemployed. I believe it is our obligation, after figuring out where we can bring more efficiency, to make sure the individuals no longer needed are provided retraining and are reallocated into new federal jobs if they so desire. Finally, in terms of increasing the president's salary, I would rather leave the salary as is, but then we could provide incentives that scale up to the amount he proposed based on the success of Andrew's American scorecard that they achieve. So with the 4 minor issues out of the way, we can now turn our attention to the 6 areas of disagreement that I don't believe compromise or clarity can address. So first, Yang believes we should eliminate the federal minimum wage. Secondly, Yang believes the media has become too fragmented and requires further consolidation and the implementation of an ombudsman to be able to counter fake news. Third, Andrew Yang believes that we should provide a $1,000 rebate to anyone that moves for work. Fourth, Andrew believes that all laws should have automatic sunset provisions. Fifth, he believes that we should create a Department of the Attention Economy to regulate social media, games, TV, movies, and other media to be more appropriate for children. And sixth, he believes we should implement a VAT, or a value-added tax. So for the first item, it should be obvious why I disagree. Because even with his freedom dividend, that will not be enough to prevent poverty at the current minimum wage. And by eliminating the minimum wage altogether, you encourage states to compete against one another to serve corporate interests to take advantage of their workforce. Second, we should not be having the government trying to control what is and what isn't fake news. That always in turn leads to a violation of free speech, as censorship becomes heavy-handed against progressive activists as well. We should be reporting the corruption of the government and not having any interference. For the third item of the moving rebate, I don't believe the government should be incentivizing moving, as that can lead to a further skill flight to metropolitan areas from rural communities that are in need of a changing skill set as other jobs become automated. Fourth, I believe it is silly to have all laws sunset. That will lead to issues like gay marriage being politicized to keep it on the books. And if the government shifts to Republican control, temporarily, those rights may be taken away until we can wrestle back Congress. This example can be reapplied time and time again on any good law we want enacted, and so it makes no sense to have them sunset. Fifth, like our second item of having an ombudsman implemented, I do not believe it is the place of government to increase its regulation on the content watched and produced for children. We must always protect our ability to speak and consume freely from the government, even if the aims of the censorship are with good intent. Sixth, and finally, we should not be implementing a VAT, because like a sales tax, it's a regressive tax. But unlike a sales tax, it actively encourages importation and discourages exportation to the point along the product life cycle in which taxes are applied. Furthermore, it risks decreasing productivity, with businesses now obliged to carry tax obligations on their books until they're cleared by the good being sold further downstream. All in all, Yang's platform is stunningly impressive. But unfortunately, the old saying is true, and that's why many corporate Democrats embrace it with platitudes. Sometimes less is more. Rather than sticking with just solutions to the big problems and instead trying to address all of his perceived issues, there's going to be a handful of issues in which disagreements occur and becomes more visible. I commend his transparency. It's just an unfortunate downside that we as voters also know more about where we disagree with him as well as where we agree with him. I'm very excited that Andrew has now qualified to be on the stage, and I sincerely hope if Bernie does win it all, he will bring Andrew Yang into his cabinet and vice versa. So now that we've gone through Yang's policies, it's time to turn to his opponent, Tulsi Gabbard, and see where she's fallen short. One thing I learned from this activity was how necessary it is to read both sides of every issue when it comes to Tulsi Gabbard. She gets a lot of criticism from the mainstream press, and some of it is misleading, while other parts are warranted. 3 criticisms that I think meet that standard of being misleading happen to be the most frequently used criticisms of her. 1, that she supports a far-right nationalist Indian leader in Modi, that she's against homosexuality, and that she supports Bashar al-Assad. Modi may be nationalistic and on the right in an Indian perspective, but in global terms, he comes closer to the center. And I've included a video in the description section that gives a good breakdown of this assertion. So, next, people say that she's homophobic, but she also has a 100% voting record in Congress on protecting LGBTQ rights, and has admitted that she has truly grown on this issue and apologizes for her past actions and beliefs after learning she was wrong to hold them during her time in service. Finally, hacks have called her an Assad apologist or an Assad toady for doubting mainstream narratives that Assad was using chemical weapons against his own people. Yet, all she did was want to wait until an independent investigation had occurred into the chemical attacks. She went to Syria to see the situation for herself. She's called him a brutal dictator, but rightfully not an enemy of the American people because he didn't threaten our citizens. And then, after investigations occurred and admitted that Assad was a brutal dictator again, she admitted that he used chemical warfare against his own people, but that the impacts of intervention still caused far more damage than if we had stayed out. Which, if you've seen any comparisons from what Syria looked like during the original chemical weapon attacks in 2012, and you look at it now, we can see that country has been absolutely destroyed because we intervened. The criticisms I will levy against Tulsi, that unfortunately had me drop her to number 3 behind Andrew Yang, and surprised me because it was originally her number 1 selling point, was her foreign policy stances. So first, she has voted with Republicans on legislation to make it tougher for refugees from Iraq and Syria trying to flee war zones from being able to get to America with the American Security Against Foreign Enemies Act, or also known as the American SAFE Act. A bill that, if it had passed the Senate in 2016, Obama had planned on vetoing. Second, she opposed the Iran deal, which helped delay nuclear proliferation efforts. Third, she supports utilizing drones without an act of war being declared or congressional authorization given. Fourth, she called for Iraq to be dissolved and instead replaced by separate Sunni Shiite states. And fifth, finally an item not related to foreign policy, she supported the Right to Try Act that will allow patients willing to do anything to live to burn through their savings in the hopes that drugs that haven't been tested will save them. This is kind of similar to a traveling snake oil salesman giving them a panacea and then running away with their money. I believe her foreign policy has shown an uneasy relationship with Islamic countries, and that concern is not diminished when you consider the majority of her first term in Congress was spent on criticizing Obama for not calling our enemies Islamic extremists. This would be less unsettling if it were not for the fact that although Tulsi Gabbard votes progressively and aligns with me on domestic issues in most cases, the near majority of her introduced legislation and sponsored bills, around 47%, is on military and foreign affairs matters, where I now find myself with some concerns. I believe Tulsi Gabbard holistically has a really good voting record. She has political courage to stand up for what she believes is the truth, and has shown the ability to grow and admit when she's wrong. And finally, that it's absolutely right that a central tenet of her campaign must be to end these regime change wars, because, like she keeps reiterating, they do more harm than good, and are costly, taking needed resources away from home. Unfortunately, the certainty that the end of the military state would come about under Tulsi Gabbard has been shaken, as she's shown little reservation to continue Obama-era policies of using unauthorized drone strikes and a fervently aggressive stance against Islamic extremism. With my certainty shaken down to simply competence, and her candidacy focusing less than Andrew Yang and Bernie Sanders on domestic issues, which I believe deserve to be a higher priority, it's in my opinion that Tulsi Gabbard now sits in our third place rankings. I hope you're okay with that. So if you enjoyed what you watched or heard today, even if you disagreed with me, I hope you'll give a subscribe to us as well as leave us a rating. It's the only way we show that the roses are growing upon our hill. Finally, let me know how your tier list compares by leaving a comment down below or by telling me on Twitter at The Hill of Roses. So that'll do it, friends. Until next time, stay rosy.